Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be talking about the basics of HTML, going over what exactly it is, how we can use it, and what the syntax will look like. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, but we can break that down a little bit further. So hypertext simply means text with links, or hyperlinks as we call them. These are links from one document on the web to another. And a markup language is a language used to annotate some kind of content or text. In the case of HTML, we will annotate the content of our web page just to tell the browser what everything is. For example, we will need to differentiate between a heading and a paragraph. And I think the best way to understand this is to look at an example, so let's take a look at one now. Here we have a blog post titled My Blog Post, and it has two sections, Day 1 and Day 2. Maybe we were on some sort of 2-day adventure and we wrote a blog post about it. Well, we as humans can look at this and just understand what everything is. We see that there's a heading on top and two sections below it. But a browser can't do this, so we need a way to tell it what everything is, and we do that by annotating it. So at the top, we have My Blog Post, and this is a heading. Specifically, this is the primary heading of the page. Then we have the text for Day 1 and Day 2, which are also headings, but rather than being the primary heading, these are subheadings or headings with less importance. And then below each of these subheadings is a paragraph. We could even get more specific and annotate things like which paragraphs are associated with which headings. But for now, let's just stick to describing what each piece of text is. But that does bring up a question. How do we actually make these annotations? What does that syntax look like? Well, we use a syntax known as a tag, and a tag is just that. It's an annotation for content in HTML. So if we had some text, say hello world for example, and we wanted to annotate this as a paragraph, we would use the paragraph tag, which is represented by the letter P. So a tag takes its name, in this case P, and it wraps it in less than and greater than signs, oftentimes referred to as the angle brackets. So on the left-hand side, we have the opening tag with less than, P, greater than, and then we have the content. In this case, it is hello world. And finally, on the right-hand side, we will have the closing tag. The one difference here will be that we need to add a / before the tag name, but after the less than sign. This / is simply to indicate that this is a closing tag, and now this is a completed annotation. And we call this combination of the tags and the content inside of them an element. In general, most tags are going to follow this format, but there are some exceptions, and these are known as empty tags or sometimes called self-closing tags. These are tags that don't have any content, and because of that, we don't include a closing tag, since there would be nothing for it to wrap. So let me give you an example. If we look back at the blog post from earlier, we had two different sections of content. But what if we wanted to put something as a break between the two sections? We call this a thematic break usually, and we have a horizontal rule tag for it, or HR. Visually, by default, this just draws a horizontal line across the page to break up the content. But this tag has no content itself, so there's no reason to have anything inside of it. This means that there's no need for a closing tag, and thus we have just an opening tag. However, this can be a little bit confusing to read sometimes because you might see a tag and not know if a closing tag is coming or not. As you get more familiar with the different tags in HTML, you will learn which ones are empty tags and which ones are not just naturally, but we do have a different syntax we can use to make this a little bit easier. So what I will do is remove the greater than sign from the end, and then we add a / after the tag name, and we have a space character between the two. Then we can add the greater than sign back in at the end as well, and this does the same thing as the other syntax, so either is perfectly fine to use. That said, it is just a personal preference, but you should try to be as consistent as possible. You don't want to go back and forth between syntaxes in the same file, because that can make things a little bit confusing to read. Now there's one final component to HTML tags that we should know about, and that's attributes. Attributes are a way for us to pass extra data to tags that will change the way the browser interprets those tags. You can think of these as similar to function parameters in traditional programming languages. So for example, what if we wanted to make a checkbox? So this is a simple box that the user can click on and it shows a check icon. Well, to do this, we use the input tag to signify to the browser that this is a user input. The input tag is an empty tag, but it's fairly generic and it's used for all kinds of different inputs. For example, we could use it for a text input or a date picker input. And we will see a variety of inputs throughout the crash course, but we need a way to specify that this input is a checkbox, and the way we can do that is with an attribute. So attributes go inside of the opening tag, or for an empty tag like input, it goes in the only tag that we have. And these attributes are going to be key value pairs. So we start with the attribute name, and in this case, we want the type. Then after the attribute name, we have an equal sign, and then the value as a string with quotation marks. So in this case, we want a checkbox, so we have the type is equal to checkbox. Then we just close out the tag like normal. And this will tell the browser that we don't want just any input, we want a type of checkbox. Now, there are a ton of different attributes for different tags, and we will see more throughout the crash course, but don't feel like you need to memorize all of them. You should be familiar with some of the more common ones, and that will come naturally as you work with HTML, and for the less common ones, it would be pretty unreasonable to expect you to have ever memorized all of them, so usually you can just look these up. Okay, so now that's pretty much all there is to HTML elements, but there is a bit more about HTML that we should know. First, let's look at comments. Just like comments in other languages, these allow us to leave a comment in the source code without affecting the output, so the browser ignores any comments when rendering the page. These comments look pretty similar to tags. We have a less than sign, and then an exclamation point, and then 2 dashes. This opens the comment, and now anything after this will be part of the comment, even if we go to a new line. Then finally, the comment will end when we have 2 dashes and a greater than sign. Now finally, let's discuss whitespace. Whitespace refers to any space characters such as spaces, tabs, and new lines. And whitespace is interesting because it is largely ignored in HTML, meaning that any whitespace we have will be collapsed into a single space. So if we look at these two paragraphs, we have this is text, and this is text with new line characters. You might expect the one on the right to display with 3 lines. However, they would actually look the same in the browser output because of the fact that those new line characters will be treated as a single space. And while this might seem unintuitive, it's actually very useful because it allows us to indent our code as we nest tags and to break up long lines of text to keep our HTML easy to read. All that said, there are still ways to get around this if you ever do need whitespace to be displayed on the page, and we will see more about that in a future crash course video, but for now, just know that whitespace is largely ignored. Okay, so now let's put this all together and look at a complete HTML file. There's going to be a bit of boilerplate that we need for creating an HTML document, so let's start with that. The first line of every HTML file will be something known as the doc type. For this, we have a less than sign, then an exclamation point, and the word doc type, usually in all capital letters. Then we will say HTML and the greater than sign. The doc type simply tells the browser that we want to use the most modern version of HTML. Technically, you can specify different doc types if you want to use an older HTML version, but we rarely ever need to do that. Next, we will open the HTML tag, which is going to be the root of the document, and this is going to contain all of the other HTML elements as its content. Specifically, the HTML tag will always contain 2 tags, the head and the body. The head is there to hold any metadata about the web page, so this is information not shown on the page, but it is still important to the browser to understand how to render the page. Then the body is going to be the complete opposite of the head. It contains all of the elements that display on the page, including all of the ones we've looked at so far. So in the head, there's one tag that is always required, and that is called title. This does exactly what it sounds like. It gives a title to the page. Browsers typically use the title for the name of the tab that you are currently on, but they can be used in other places as well, such as search engine results. Now we can move into the body, which is where we have the actual content of the page. Here we could add a paragraph of Hello World, just like we saw earlier. And once we close out this tag, we will have a completed HTML file. So we could give this file to the browser and it would understand it. It would know that this is an HTML page with the title of my blog post, and it would know that the only content to display on the page needs to be this paragraph that says Hello World. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video on the basics of HTML. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.